What if I told you that during World War II, the United States government built an entire city in just 18 months, made it vanish from every map, and swore 75,000 people to absolute secrecy? A place where young women operated machines they didn't understand, where husbands and wives kept secrets from each other at the dinner table, where an entire community helped end a war without knowing how. This wasn't science fiction. This was Tennessee. In the summer of 1942, something strange started happening in the valleys of East Tennessee. Families who had farmed the same land for generations received letters from the government. They had 60 days to leave. No explanations, no negotiations. Just leave. The land belonged to America now, they were told, and America needed it for the war effort. Entire communities disappeared. Churches where people had been baptized and buried. General stores where everyone knew your name. One-room schoolhouses where 3 generations had learned to read. Gone. Bulldozed flat before the autumn leaves fell. Picture old Mrs. Henderson watching from the road as the bulldozers tore through her family cemetery. 5 generations buried there, and she had 2 weeks to move the graves or leave them. The Johnson family dairy farm, where they'd milked cows every morning since 1870. Flattened. The swimming hole where every kid in the valley learned to swim. Filled in. An entire way. Of life erased like chalk from a blackboard. Then came the workers. Thousands of them. Then tens of thousands. They arrived on buses and trains with a single piece of paper telling them to report to a place that had no name. Young women from small southern towns, engineers from northern universities, construction workers from every state in between. What were they building? Nobody knew, and that was the point. They called it the Clinton Engineer Works at first, then Site X. Eventually, it got a name that sounded almost normal, Oak Ridge. But there was nothing normal about it. This was a city built entirely in secret, hidden behind fences and guarded checkpoints where asking too many questions could get you fired or worse. The recruiter's pitch was simple and vague. Good pay, important war work, a chance to serve your country. Young women working as secretaries in small towns suddenly found themselves on trains heading south with no idea where they were going. They'd been told to pack. For 6 months. They'd been told it was patriotic. They'd been told nothing else. When they arrived, the shock was immediate. Miles of barbed wire fences, guard towers every few hundred feet, armed soldiers checking papers at gates that looked like prison entrances. And beyond the gates, a sea of identical buildings stretching as far as you could see, all of them rising from mud so thick it sucked the shoes off your feet. By 1945, Oak Ridge was the 5th largest city in Tennessee, the 5th largest city in an entire state, and it didn't appear on a single map. You couldn't find it in a phone book. If you told someone you lived there, you'd have to lie about where it was. The government built everything at lightning speed. Dormitories that slept 8 women to a room. Cafeterias that served 3 meals a day to thousands. Rec halls where people danced on Saturday nights. Movie theaters that showed the latest Hollywood pictures, churches for every denomination, schools for the workers' children. A complete city materialized from red Tennessee mud in less time than it takes most people to build a single house. But Oak Ridge wasn't the same city for everyone. While white workers lived in those cramped but functional dormitories, African American workers were housed in segregated hutments in an area called Gamble Valley. These weren't just separate, they were inferior by design. Wooden shacks with no insulation, often without running water or heat. Families slept on cots with thin blankets while winter wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Black families frequently couldn't join their relatives who worked there. The inequality was stark and deliberate, a reminder that even in building the future, America couldn't escape its past. The work itself remained a mystery. Young women sat at control panels watching dials and adjusting knobs for 8-hour shifts. If a dial went too high, turn it down. If it went too low, turn it up. What were they? Controlling? Don't ask. Engineers calculated figures that fed into larger calculations they never saw completed. Chemists processed materials they couldn't identify. Construction workers built massive facilities without knowing what would happen inside them. These young women, many fresh out of high school, became known as the Calutron Girls. They operated electromagnetic separators in the Y12 plant, keeping needles centered on their control panels. Hour after hour, day after day, watching dials and turning knobs. The work was monotonous beyond belief. Some women said they dreamed about those dials at night, watching needles swing left and right in their sleep. The irony was beautiful and strange. Scientists from Yale and Berkeley struggled with the process because they wanted to understand it. The girls from Tennessee and Kentucky just wanted the needle to stay put, and they were better at it. Far better. Their efficiency outpaced the educated men who designed the machines. They treated it like a game, competing to see who could keep their needle steadiest the longest. Management noticed. They started hiring more young women and fewer scientists for the control panels. Education didn't matter. Understanding didn't matter. Results mattered. And the high school graduates from rural America were getting better results than PhD physicists. The buildings themselves were monuments to impossible ambition. The K-25 plant stretched a full mile in a U-shape, the largest building under one roof anywhere on Earth at that time. Walking from one end to the other took 20 minutes. Inside, it hummed with machinery that consumed more electricity than entire cities. The noise was deafening. Workers shouted to be heard standing 3 feet apart. Outside, workers trudged through mud in rubber boots, heating their shacks with coal stoves. It was the future built in a swamp, the 21st century rising from 19th century conditions. You could be inside a building, operating the most advanced technology on the planet, and then walk outside into conditions that hadn't changed since your grandparents' time. The secrecy was absolute and everywhere. Posters covered every wall. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, let it stay here when you leave here. The enemy is listening. Loose lips sink ships. Giant billboards showed cartoons of Hitler and Hirohito eavesdropping on American workers. The message was clear and constant: silence or sabotage. There was no middle ground. Training for new workers included stern warnings about security. You could be fired for asking what you were making. You could be fired for asking what the person next to you was making. You could be fired for wondering out loud why the building you worked in had no windows. Curiosity wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Mothers couldn't tell their daughters what they did all day. Husbands and wives ate dinner in silence, each knowing the other held secrets they couldn't share. Imagine sitting across the table from someone you loved, wanting to talk about your day, and having to lie or stay quiet. Every single night, for years. But the silence ran deeper than just keeping secrets from family. The government planted informants throughout Oak Ridge. They sat in cafeterias, listening to casual conversations. They watched movies alongside regular workers. They bowled in the same leagues. They looked like everyone else because they were everyone else. If someone complained too much about the mud or asked too many curious questions about the work, they simply vanished. Gone from their job the next day with no explanation. Their bunk in the dormitory empty by evening. Other workers learned not to ask where people went. You noticed. You said nothing. That was the rule. One woman remembered her roommate disappearing overnight. They'd shared a room for 6 months. Then one morning, the bed was stripped and a new girl moved in before lunch. When she asked what happened, the supervisor just stared at her until she stopped talking. She never asked again. Mail was censored. Every letter coming in or going out was read by government officials who blackened out anything that might reveal too much. You couldn't tell your mother back home about your new job. You couldn't describe the strange buildings you worked in. You couldn't even mention the town's real location. Letters arrived addressed to post office boxes with no city name, no state, just a number. Families back home worried. Their daughters or sons had vanished into some unnamed place in Tennessee, doing some unnamed work. Letters came back with entire paragraphs blacked out. Parents sent care packages to post office box numbers and hoped they arrived. Despite the secrecy and paranoia, life went on in ways that felt almost normal. Young people fell in love at weekend dances in the rec halls. The jukebox played Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey. Couples danced close under dim lights, swaying to music that reminded them of home. They couldn't talk about work, so they talked about everything else. Babies were born in the Oak Ridge Hospital, their birth certificates listing a city that officially didn't exist. New mothers held infants who were technically born nowhere. Kids played baseball in dusty lots between the barracks. Women formed book clubs and garden societies. Men bowled in leagues and played poker on Friday nights. The normalcy was deliberate. Keep people busy. Keep them entertained. Keep them from thinking too hard about what they were doing. The mud was legendary. Tennessee red clay that turned every street into a sticky mess when it rained. Women ruined shoes by the dozens walking to work. Construction never stopped, so the mud never stopped either. People joked that Oak Ridge had two seasons, dust and mud. One woman remembered sinking up to her knees, trying to cross a street. It took 3 people to pull her out, and she lost both shoes in the process. They were still down there somewhere, she'd joke years later. Buried in what became the foundation of a research building. Housing was whatever the government could build fast. Prefab houses called Semesto homes that looked identical down every street. Trailers brought in by the hundreds. Wooden hutments that were little more than shacks. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. Walls were thin enough to hear every conversation. Bathrooms were shared by entire floors. Lines formed every morning for showers. And still, nobody knew what they were building. The rumor mill worked overtime. They were making a cure for cancer. They were building a weapon to sink Japanese ships from underwater. They were creating rocket fuel. They were developing a death ray like in the comic books. Every theory was wrong, and every theory made the rounds anyway. Some rumors were deliberately planted by security to test who was talking. If a specific false rumor made it back to the wrong ears, they knew who the leak was. The paranoia fed on itself. But there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Some workers noticed strange things happening to their tools. A wrench that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Hands that looked different under certain lights. An exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. A metallic taste that wouldn't go away. Nosebleeds for no reason. They were working with uranium and plutonium, handling radioactive materials without understanding what radiation meant. The danger was invisible, tasteless, odorless. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Some workers wore film badges that were supposed to detect exposure, but nobody explained what the badges measured or what the readings meant. Years later, some of those workers would develop cancers. Others would have children with birth defects. The government would deny responsibility for decades. But in those days, nobody knew enough to be afraid of the right things. Then came August 6, 1945, a Monday. The morning shift was already at work when the news started spreading. Something big had happened. Then the radio announcement: an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. President Truman's voice crackled through the speakers in the rec hall, mentioning Oak Ridge by name. The secret was out. The mystery was solved. The reaction was immediate and complicated. The women who had watched those dials suddenly understood they'd been enriching uranium. The engineers realized their calculations had helped split the atom. The construction workers learned they'd built the facilities that won the war. The Calutron Girls discovered that their simple task of keeping a needle centered had separated the isotopes that powered the bomb. Some workers cheered. They'd won the war. Their work mattered. They were heroes. Others sat in stunned silence. They'd killed 100,000 people in an instant. Both reactions were right. Both reactions were true. One woman remembered running back to her dormitory and crying for hours. Not because she regretted it, but because she finally understood the weight of what she'd been carrying. That needle she'd watched for 8 hours a day had been death itself, and she'd been very, very good at her job. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another bomb. More deaths. This one used plutonium processed at Oak Ridge. The workers absorbed that news in silence. The cheering stopped. The war ended. The silence continued. 75,000 people had kept a secret so profound it changed the course of human history. And they'd done it without knowing what the secret was. How do you process that? After the war, Oak Ridge faced a strange question. What do you do with a secret city that's not secret anymore? The government considered shutting it down entirely. It was expensive to maintain. The mission was complete. Why keep it? But the people who lived there fought back. They'd built lives in this impossible place. They'd survived the mud and the secrecy and the paranoia. They wanted to stay. This was home now, for better or worse. Petitions circulated. Letters poured into Washington. Workers threatened to strike if the government tried to shut Oak Ridge down. The message was clear. We built your bomb. Now let us keep our city. Still, Oak Ridge remained a closed city. The fences stayed up. The checkpoints remained staffed. You still needed special permission to enter. The paranoia of wartime stretched into peacetime as the Cold War began, and Oak Ridge shifted from building bombs to building more bombs. For 4 more years, Oak Ridge existed in limbo. Not quite secret anymore, but not quite open either. The workers could finally tell their families what they'd done, but strangers still couldn't visit. The city appeared on some maps, but not others. Finally, on March 19, 1949, the gates opened for good. No more checkpoints, no more guards checking identification, no more fences keeping the world out and the residents in. It was a massive event covered by newspapers across the country. Thousands of people lined up to drive through the gates that had imprisoned them for years. Some cried, some cheered, some just sat in their cars, staring at the open road ahead, not quite believing it was real. After 7 years of living in a cage, even a gilded one, the people of Oak Ridge could finally breathe freely. But freedom felt foreign after so long. Some workers admitted they felt nervous without the fences. They'd gotten used to the security. Maps finally showed its location. You could mail a letter with Oak Ridge, Tennessee, written right on the envelope. The city that had been erased from geography suddenly appeared again, like a ghost becoming solid. Tour buses started arriving. Journalists showed up asking questions. The secret city became a tourist attraction almost overnight. But something had changed in the people who lived through those secret years. They'd learned to hold their tongues, to keep their heads down. For years after the war, many still felt uneasy talking about what they'd done. The habit of secrecy ran deep, deeper than conscious thought. One veteran worker said it took her 20 years before she could talk about Oak Ridge without looking over her shoulder. Even in her own living room, she'd lower her voice when mentioning the work. The conditioning was that strong. The children who grew up in Oak Ridge had a unique childhood. They were born in a city that didn't exist. They went to schools in a place they couldn't tell their grandparents about. They played in yards surrounded by fences and guards. They thought armed checkpoints were normal. Years later, when they tried to explain their hometown to friends in college, people didn't believe them. A secret city in Tennessee with 75,000 people? Some kids learned to just lie and say they were from Knoxville. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. The farmhouses that once dotted those valleys are gone forever. The families who worked that land scattered across the country, never to return. Where there were once fields of tobacco and corn, there are now research facilities and museums. The cemetery where Mrs. Henderson's family was buried is underneath a parking lot now. The swimming hole is a retention pond. The past was literally bulldozed to build the future. Today, Oak Ridge is a real city with real addresses and real lives. But drive through its streets, and you can still feel the ghost of what it was. The old Semesto homes still stand on some blocks, identical boxes that once held secret lives. The massive facilities where uranium was enriched are now tourist attractions. You can walk through buildings where history was made by people who didn't know they were making it. The K-25 plant, that mile-long monster of steel and secrecy, was demolished in 2013. It took years to tear down, the largest building demolition in history, bringing down the largest building in history. Workers said you could feel it in your chest when the charges went off, the boom echoing across the same valleys where farms once stood. The generation that built Oak Ridge is fading now. The young women who watched those dials are in their 90s or gone. The engineers who did those calculations have passed their stories to children and grandchildren. The construction workers who built a city in 18 months have mostly left this world. The Calutron Girls hold reunions, but each year fewer of them attend. But their achievement remains staggering. They built a city larger than most state capitals in complete secrecy. They kept that secret despite living packed together in cramped quarters where privacy was impossible. They trusted their government so completely they were willing to do work they didn't understand for reasons they weren't told. Whether you see that as admirable or terrifying probably depends on how you feel about the bomb they helped create. Oak Ridge represents something uniquely American. The can-do spirit that could transform empty valleys into a functioning city faster than most people build a subdivision. The willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for a greater cause. The ability to keep a secret even from yourself. The pride of contributing to victory even if you didn't know how you were contributing. It also represents something darker. The government's power to erase communities and rewrite geography. The ease with which people accepted surveillance and censorship when told it was for national security. The moral complexity of building weapons of mass destruction. The permanent loss of the communities and ways of life that existed before the bulldozers came. The families who farmed those valleys never got their land back. The government paid them fair market value, but you can't put a price on generations of history plowed under. Their churches and schools and homes exist now only in fading photographs and memories. Can you imagine watching your entire world disappear for a project you weren't allowed to understand? The next time you drive through a small town, think about Oak Ridge. Think about how quickly a place can appear or disappear when history decides it's necessary. Those 75,000 people proved that Americans could keep a secret, build the impossible, and change the world without fanfare or recognition. They also proved that progress always costs something, and sometimes what it costs is the past itself. Do you know something else about this? Let it down in the comments.